Okay, I think we are actually live. Welcome to the folks who are joining from live stream, and welcome to Valerie, Lucas, and Monica. And John will hopefully be joining us in just a moment. We are really excited about this conversation today. It feels, unfortunately, a little bit too of the moment. And I'm happy to be joined today by a member of the Building Belonging community, Monica Guzman. Monica is a bridger, journalist, and entrepreneur, community builder, and she's co-founder of the Seattle-based Evergrey publication. She's currently writing a book on how we can stay curious in conversations across difference, which feels very timely. Her signature block, I just learned, describes her as a asymplastic neophile, which perhaps she can explain to you. Monica is a member of the Building Belonging founding cohort, the group helping us think through a lot of these questions about how do we do this? How do we build belonging online? And is one of the most thoughtful and nuanced people I know around this question of bridging and belonging. Belonging is core to her life work, and I couldn't think of a better person to host this conversation. So I'm going to step back in a moment and do the tech. I'll be disappearing off screen, and we'll be interacting with the folks who are on the live chat. But before I do that, just a quick introduction and a bit of context conversation. So my name is Brian Stout. I came across the term recently, a deep generalist, which is a nicer way of saying I could never choose a specific subject to stick with, making all of my academic advisors upset over the years. I'm a middle child, I'm a mediator, I'm a network weaver and a father of 2 little kids based in Seattle on land traditionally stewarded by the Duwamish and Coast Salish people. And the rest of my house, this is a very sanitized view you're getting. My kids have wreaked havoc around here. I'm helping shepherd an emergent collaborative called Building Belonging. And right now we're conceiving of it as an online home for people who are committed to building a world where everyone belongs. You can find out more at buildingbelonging.us. One thing we're doing is curating this series of what we're calling Conversations on Transformation, which is a set of around 20 discussions among advanced practitioners, folks like Lucas and Valerie and John, around a diverse range of disciplines, highlighting different aspects of how change happens, how transformation for individuals at an interpersonal societal level and for systems and structures. Today's conversation is about the power of bridging, and our speakers will speak to how they understand that term and invite folks in the live chat to bring their own definitions as well. And thus, it's about the relationship between individual and interpersonal transformation. How do we connect and change a relationship? Though I trust our speakers will also talk about how we bridge to different aspects of ourselves, even within our own bodies. So I will see you in the live chat, and I will join at the end of the conversation and talk a bit about next steps. But for now, let me turn to Monica. Thanks for your time.
All right. Thank you, Brian. And thanks everyone for joining us. I could not be more excited about this conversation. Bridging is a concept that is coming up so much because the world needs it. And the world needs to embrace and reckon with its brokenness and figure out where bridges need to be built. There's a lot of folks that are leaning into that work and have a lot of really good and hard and tough questions about how you do it. We have really, really cool people here to talk about this today. Valerie Cower and Lucas Johnson, with John Powell hopefully joining very soon. I wanted to start off by satisfying perhaps your curiosity. If you heard Brian's introduction of me, I do my email signature. I call myself an asymplastic neophile. It is a trick. I want people to get curious and look it up because I'm writing a book about curiosity and it just seemed apt. Asymplastic is a word that the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge invented some time ago, and it means to weave disparate things into a whole. And a neophile is someone who loves new things. I happen to really like weaving disparate things into wholes, and I happen to love new things. So that's the explanation of that. So one frame I want to put around bridging a little bit as we think of this is there are so many divisions in society and lots of conversations about where we are divided in a broken way. There are also lots of conversations about where people want to stay separate and push others away, where that seems right, where it seems wrong. And I imagine in my head, so many islands magically drifting apart. And I ask, what does bridging look like in that world? Where do the bridges need to be built? Where are we pulling them up that we should actually be expanding them again? So that's the visual that I begin with. I am going to turn it over first to Lucas and then to Valerie to introduce ourselves to their work and to connect to this conversation about bridging by just telling us, first Lucas and then Valerie, as you introduce yourselves, what to you does the concept of bridging boil down to? What is that core thing that you want to say into this moment about bridging for us to launch this conversation? No pressure, no pressure. It has to be really good. Lucas, take it away.
And of course, I have to go first then. Hi, everyone. My name is Lucas Johnson, and I am the executive director of On Being's civil conversation and social healing initiatives. And the On Being project, as some of you may know, is the project behind the radio program that airs on NPR called On Being with Krista Tippett, and it's also available on your podcast feeds. Our work centers around 3 animating questions: what does it mean to be human? How should we live? And who should we be to each other? And my background is I come to this work after organizing and working in the peace building and nonviolence field and area. I'm trained as a pastor, and so I come to this work from a perspective of what inner life and spirituality has to bring to this conversation of bridging and belonging. And yeah, and I would say, let's see. So Monica, you said, what is the distillation of, how did you frame the question again?
Yeah. If you were really to put the whole conversation of bridging into a pot and boil it down, what do you think is going to be left when everything is condensed to its essence?
You know, maybe it's because you've made me curious, referencing curiosity, but I think that one of the ways that I think about the human experience is that we go through life and we encounter, opportunities that are actually invitations to go inward, and those invitations send us back outward, and bridging is not only about, in order to connect with others, we a part of connecting with others means connecting well with ourselves. And so I see it as a process, and maybe I'll stop there, and I'll leave it to that.
That's great. That's actually a perfect segue, I think, to Valerie. So yeah, introduce yourself, Valerie, and tell us what bridging boils down to you.
First of all, I'm just so delighted to spend this time with you all. I mean, this is such a breathless time, and to have these 90 minutes to sit with people who I adore and I admire and whose life work gives me breath is just, it's exactly what keeps me going in a moment like this. So thank you for creating the space. Thank you for creating these conversations. I am a civil rights activist. I'm a lawyer. I'm a filmmaker. I have been in the work laboring with Brown and Black communities in the face of injustice for almost 20 years. I became an activist shortly after the horror of September 11th, when hate violence swept across America, and Balbir Singh Sodhi, who I called an uncle, was the first person killed in a hate crime. And really, ever since then, almost 20 years, with every film, with every campaign, with every lawsuit, I thought we were making the nation safer for the next generation. This president took power shortly after I became a new mother, and I had a total crisis. I thought, what was it all for, if not to make the nation safer for my children, and reckoning with the fact that my son and daughter, the country more dangerous for them than it was for me, or even than it was for my grandfather when he arrived a century ago. Oh, I was paralyzed. And the only thing that gave me some glimmer of hope was this question that kept rising in me. The future is dark. The future is dark. But what if? What if this darkness in our nation, in our world, what if this darkness right now is not the darkness of the tomb, but the darkness of the womb? What is dying and what is longing to be born? What if our America, the America that we dream, is a country that is still waiting to be born? Then the midwife says to breathe and to push, to breathe and to push. So what does it look like to labor? And when I offered those words, the video was seen, I think, 40 million times around the world. And people were saying, okay, I'm ready. I'm ready to breathe. But how? How do I breathe? And how do I push? How do we labor for justice when the labor feels endless? And I needed to answer those questions for myself more than anyone else. And so I was given a gift that few women who are mothers and activists are ever given. I was given time off and a room of my own. And I went to the rainforest in Central America. Lucas, I think about you in Amsterdam. Sometimes we have to leave the country in order to see the country more clearly. And I poured through the stories of my life, and I poured through the stories of social movements in the past. And I had your book on my shelf. I was pouring through wise voices that have given us frameworks that we could work with. And I began to see patterns that I now call practices of revolutionary love. So I believe revolutionary love is the call of our times. I define revolutionary love as the choice to labor for others, for our opponents, and for ourselves. It is the choice to be brave enough to see no stranger, to see no stranger. So the words of Guru Nanak, the first words that he uttered after his revelation, he's the founder of the Sikh faith, were "Nako bedi nahi begana, Nako bedi nahi begana." I see no enemy, I see no stranger. If I am called to embrace this vision that we are one human family, then I must be able to look upon the face of anyone around me and say, you are a part of me I do not yet know. You are a part of me I do not yet know. The book I ended up writing is called, it just came out, See No Stranger, a memoir and manifesto of revolutionary love. I lay out these 10 core practices of revolutionary love. But if I was going to boil it all down, Monica, you asked us to boil it all down, which is really hard. But I think it's this word, Nako bedi nahi begana, to see no stranger, to look upon the face of anyone out there, but also to look within. For so many of us who are people of color, women of color, we live in a culture that wants to make us strange to ourselves, to see no stranger, even when we're looking within, to return to that sense of wholeness and connection. I think that's what bridging looks like now. And my offering is that the way that we bridge is to be brave enough to practice revolutionary love.
Thank you, Valerie. We're already seeing some commonalities. Lucas talked about invitation inward that then goes outward. And Valerie mentioned this idea of seeing no stranger. So John, tell us about yourself. Welcome. And what bridging, this whole big thing, complicated thing, boils down to in your heart. Oh, and I think you're muted, John. Sorry about that. There you go.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. So thank you for the question, and it's great to be in company with such thoughtful, wonderful, and loving people, which already makes the day a better day. So there's a number of ways of thinking about bridging, and I was just on another webinar, and sorry for being a little late. It's actually still going on. I had to jump off because I got double booked. But one of the speakers talked about where people weaponize difference. So we may have differences that we are shy about or concerned about or even not comfortable with. As Valerie said, so we may see strangers and be, how do we respond? Excuse me. And I remember being a kid and, parents saying, don't talk to strangers, right? And of course, the world in some ways is made up of strangers, and in some ways, as Valerie said, there are no strangers. But the suggestion was, even from my parents who were trying to keep me safe, the strangers are dangerous. and we have to guard against them. And when you take that and it gets weaponized at a large level, so we're not talking about just what happens in our families, but what happens with a president like a Donald Trump or like Modi, that actually takes all of those complicated human emotions, human longings, both for connections and also for security, and weaponize them. Then I think the need for bridging becomes much more deliberate and much more fraught, because we can even be punished by our own group for recognizing others as non-enemies. And so we get disciplines and sometimes punished and sometimes excommunicated if we refuse to acknowledge that that person is the enemy. And it's compounded by the fact that people are being hurt. So it's not an abstract concept. And I can give you a concrete example that I haven't been public about, but I will now. And that is, we have these uprisings, which are the largest uprising for justice. And I won't even just say racial justice, justice writ large, but certainly with the focus on anti-Black racism and white supremacy. But the call for justice actually is, from my perspective, a bridging justice. It's a justice for all of us. It's a justice for Muslims. It's a justice for women. It's a justice for gays and straight. It's a justice for immigrants. And it's a justice for white people. So we have this large movement happening and this call for justice. And then we think, well, what about the police? Can we continue to hold them in community? Even as we think about totally restructuring the way we police, totally restructuring, maybe it's disbanding, maybe it's defunding, maybe it's reimagining, but can we actually continue to hold, in this case, in this instance, the police who have been weaponized and have tremendous amount of power and money and literally guns and license to kill. So it's a complicated question, right? Can we, and yet if we can't, I think we start back down a rabbit hole. So to me, bridging is this notion, not just of engaging at a personal, interpersonal level, but also thinking about how, again, these institutions and groups of people have been weaponized. And I'll say one last thing. Unfortunately, we don't have contact with each other except under very stylized way. Most of us probably don't know police officers. Most of us probably don't know Trump supporters. Most of us, and they don't know us, right? And so to Valerie's point, it's great if we could see and know and love each other, but we don't. We don't get to see each other. So bridging calls for, to me, some deliberate effort to close that schism, but to do it thoughtfully, from the heart, from the head, and from the community. I'll stop there.
So you talked about effort, which reflects Valerie's concept of labor, the choice to do the labor. So I am curious about each of you personally. We're living in a world where there is the option to bridge, to see the divisions and the challenges as opportunities. There is the option, as you phrase it, John, to break, to see the divisions and fueled by these anxieties in the world right now as a threat and something to justify further divisions and distance. So I want to know from each of you, starting with Lucas, what was the moment where you recognized in yourself a commitment to bridging as opposed to a kind of breaking? Tell us that story.
You know, it's hard for me to choose a story, but I feel like one of the ways that I would frame it is a formation not to be broken. You know, I feel like that's as much the question as is, do you choose to bridge? It's also, you know, because I think that on many levels, we are at times born into relationship that we then later get brought out of. And I think that
So in other words, something breaks and somehow you resist. Is that what you're getting at?
right, right. So I'm just I'm challenging the structure of the idea of choosing to bridge.
Yes, please.
Because it's also that you choose not to be broken, so to speak, and
Right.
I think both are true. And if I was going to describe in my life, I mean, I feel like my parents grew up in the segregated South, and I was formed in a tradition and a spiritual practice of love, and of a choice to love one's opponents, and
What did that look like growing up? How did that manifest?
it manifests by seeing my grandmother respond to bigotry with kindness, and it manifests by the stories that I was told by her, of how she dealt with the experience of Klansmen, threatening her and such, um, and so I feel like I have to credit a formation before I talk about the choices that I made. Right, I have to credit the experiences that brought me to this point. I think later in life, the experiences that I had to bridge. I mean, my identity, the different communities to whom I belong, as someone who is a Black American, as someone who identifies as queer, like the experiences of difference in my life, on one hand, made me feel like I was, they were lonely experiences in some ways, and in some moments, particularly, being queer. But then those experiences became invitations for me to look for others who were like me, and in looking for others who were like me, I discovered, like, they were invitations that inspired a sense of curiosity within me. And so I think that in some ways the experience of difference, which invited me, which made me curious and made me um, self-aware. And as I began to look at the experience, look at how other people were experiencing themselves in relationship to me, it made me realize the common experience of loneliness, right? And how not alone I was in that experience. And so I think that along with the formation, the choices that I made to bridge were choices that I made to respond to difficult experiences at times.
Yes.
And Howard Thurman talks about how he uses this expression religious experience, and he talks about how religious experience sends one not into not just into life, but into lives, right? And how that experience that calls into one a sort of calls one towards a sort of transcendence, looks for a transcendence connection,
Yes.
is one that can also be, and is also a profound. I keep using the word invitation because it's a choice that we're confronted with, right?
Yes.
And we can choose to ignore the what we're being given in that invitation, or we can choose to walk into it. And so it's hard for me to name one experience, but I see it as a journey, as a continuation, and sometimes I've made the right choice, and sometimes I haven't. But it's a journey that I think I'm still on.
Yeah, it does seem to be one that is always going to run into new bumps, and you keep going. So Valerie, we'll go to you next on that.
About 15 years after Lobir Sodi was murdered, I remember standing at his gas station where he bled to death. And I was with the Sodi family, and every year they just like transformed this ordinary Chevron gas station into this living memorial. People come, we eat, we sing, we mourn, we grieve. And it had been 15 years as I was putting the candles down on the place where he had died. I was standing next to his brother, Rana Sodi, who has told his brother's story for all of this time. And he turned to me, and this is a time when hate violence was just skyrocketing once again. And he said, nothing has changed. And I said, well, who is the one person we have not yet tried to love? And who's the one person we have not yet tried to bridge to? So the next morning we called Bilbir Uncle's murderer in prison, Frank Roque. And in the beginning, I just thought this was a mistake. You know, we started with this act of wonder. We asked why, and he began to say, well, I'm sorry for what happened to your uncle, but I'm sorry for the thousands who were killed on 9/11. And I was feeling rage rise in me, almost as if to protect Rana. And because I was feeling that rage, Rana could continue to wonder about Frank and listen and try to bridge, you know, what seemed like an impossible chasm. And Rana said, Frank, this is the first time I've heard you say you were sorry. And Frank starts to make a move toward Rana. He says, yes, I am sorry for what I did to your brother. And when I go to heaven to be judged by God, I will ask to see your brother, and I will embrace him, and I will ask for his forgiveness. And Rana said, we've already forgiven you. I thought about that moment for so long afterwards, because I was learning that forgiveness is not forgetting. Forgiveness is this freedom from hate. But it took 15 years for us to make that call. It took 15 years of grieving and raging and people loving us in order for us to find ourselves in a moment where we wanted, as Lucas describes, we wanted to extend the invitation to ourselves and to him to try to build that bridge. And that moment would not have been possible unless somebody was in the prison all those 15 years, tending to the wound in Frank, sitting with him, listening to him, helping him grieve, helping him stand the heat of his own shame and in his own guilt to get to the point where he could want to offer an apology. So I believe that each of us has a different role in this labor of revolutionary love. That revolutionary love can only be practiced in community. When John suggests, like, well, what do we do with the police? I believe that we have different roles. Like, if you are the person who has their knee, has a knee on your neck right now, like so many Black people, brown people have right now, if the knee is on your neck, it is not necessarily your role in this moment to look up and to wonder about your oppressor or to try to build any kind of bridge. Like, your job is to survive. Your job is to take the next breath. Your job is to love yourself well enough. That is the revolutionary act. But if you are safe enough by virtue of the color of your skin or whatever privilege you have to start to sit with people like them, those officers, those perpetrators, I find this book is full of stories of sitting with white supremacists and prison guards and soldiers and police officers and my former abusers, sitting with them. And beneath the slogans and the sound bites, I inevitably hear their story and I see their wound. And I have come to believe that there's no such thing as monsters in this world. There are only human beings who are wounded, who do what they do out of their own sense of insecurity or anxiety or greed or blindness. And that participation in these projects of oppression, these projects of dehumanization, it takes a toll even on them. Our suffering is not equivalent, but it is a woundedness that someone needs to tend. So I think there's something about role literacy, like, what is my role in this moment in history? Is it to pour love into myself because I need to survive, my people need to survive? Is it to start to build bridges with others, other communities who are in harm's way? Or am I in a position to build bridges with my opponents so that I can bring back information about how to tend to their wounds and hold up a vision of a nation that liberates all of us, even them?
I want to go back to something you said to pick up on role literacy, and John and Lucas, I'd also love to, as we keep going through some of the structures I'm laying out for you, I'd encourage us all to engage with each other and build up on these ideas. But you mentioned in your story, Valerie, that because I was feeling the rage, right, in the phone call with Frank, the murderer of my friend as a hate crime after 9/11, because I was feeling the rage, Rana could bridge.
That's
and
right.
You've said that often bridging is most effective done in community, and I guess this is probably what you mean. But I bet that we've all seen the parts of the discourse that would rage against what you just said, Valerie, that would say no. There are monsters. There are monsters. I am not going to spend a second with them, and neither should anybody else. I'm tending to my wounds fine, but we're all wounded by their harm. We should all be shunning, excluding, because that's the only way the world can move forward together. One question I like to ask out of a sense of curiosity is, what is the most generous articulation of a point of view that I resist? And that's a question I offer for y'all too. When you think about that point of view, yes, there are monsters. Bridging is idiotic. Or we only do bridging on my terms in the places that I want to do, and everyone else can go, I would love to hear reflections on that. But John, I'll turn it to you, wherever you would like to pick up this conversation.
So Monica, you asked great questions, hard questions, impossible questions. So there's no single truth or single answer, I think. Valerie shared a wonderful saying in terms of there are no strangers, there's no enemy. And at the same time, you have people who commit hideous crimes, both in an individual capacity and the collective capacity. And so I completely agree that on some level, we have the right and even the obligation to take care of ourselves. Although I always think self-care is overstated, because we never can just take care of ourselves. We always need others. But I'm also reminded of Judith Butler's new book on nonviolence. And she said one of the exceptions people make in terms of nonviolence is the right for self-defense, the right for, and she says the interesting question in that statement that comes out of that statement is, who is the self? And what she does with that is basically make a turn and to say that the self is not John Powell in this body. The self is connected and always in relationship. And to the point that Lucas made, when, from my perspective, in some ways, when the self tries to live outside of relationship, the self is broken. So part of bridging is not simply about reaching out to the other, because there is no other. It's reaching out to ourselves. It's reaching out to different aspects of ourselves. It doesn't mean that we won't lock a person up. It doesn't mean we won't fight back. It doesn't mean, ultimately, in some cases, we won't kill. But here's the contradiction. Can we kill and hold on to all of our humanity? And I think as soon as we push someone out of that humanity, for whatever reason, we've actually lost our own humanity. And we also are always multiple. So yes, that person is a murderer, but the person is not just a murderer. The person may be a brother or a son or father or a wounded kid. And part of bridging, I think, helps us get in touch not only with different aspects of the apparent other, but different aspects of ourselves. There are times when of trauma that we get heightened and we are stuck in a single place. But that's not a healthy place. So again, it's just layered full of complex. And you had asked earlier about early experience of bridging. One story I share sometime, it's when I was about 11 years old living in Detroit, and I'm 6 of 9 children. My father's passed recently. My mom passed much earlier. But my father and mother were very devout Christian. My father was a Christian minister. And the church taught that unless you accepted Jesus, you were going to go to hell. And for whatever reason, when I was around 10, I started reading about people in other parts of the world. And I ran across a book about Chinese. And at the time, I think there were 900,000 Chinese in the world, not quite a billion. And it struck me as a 10 or 11-year-old that, so 900,000 people, 900 million, I said 1,000, 900 million people are going to go to hell because they haven't accepted Jesus. That struck me as problematic. And at my father's church, at the end of every service, they would always ask the question, they would end the service by saying, does anyone have any questions? And on this particular Sunday, when they asked the question, I stood up. And it was only in retrospect I realized that no one had ever stood up. And the church made an audible, and the minister was speaking, it was Brother Manuel. He said, that's all right, that's all right. Brother Powell, what is your question? And I said, what's going to happen to the Chinese? And there was this, again, this audible, what? It's like, this is an all Black church, essentially. And I'd never even seen a Chinese. I never went back to church. And it created tremendous chasm for years in my family. And I thought I was going to hell. But it struck me that I couldn't be associated with something. And so I talked to God frequently then, not anymore, saying, I've done a lot of bad things and I'm not saying my heart is pure, but on this issue, this is not about me. I can't be aligned with something that would take 1 billion people and send them to hell, would never have them given a chance. So the last thing I'll say is that I think also the universe calls on us. And I think we respond, and if we don't respond, it's at our own peril. That it's not a personal choice in that sense. That there's something deeper than that holds us, that calls us, that demands of us. And if we don't respond for whatever reason, we pay a price. If we do respond, we may pay a different price, but at least our soul is intact, our heart is intact. So to me, we're deeply interrelated already. The question, can we live with that? And in that interrelationship, the relationships are not always positive. Even with ourselves, we do violence to ourselves and we do violence to each other. But can we still care about each other?
Mm-hmm. Well, Valerie, did you want to say something, please?
Yes, John, your story returned me to my childhood, because I was on the other end of the story. I mean, as a little brown, sick girl growing up in the farmlands of California, there were so many dangerous and violent almost encounters with friends and with teachers who told me that I was going to hell. And I remember losing my best friend over this and her agony. I mean, I was in agony, but I was witnessing her agony because she wanted so to love me. And yet she had inherited a theology that severed her from her own inner knowing, from her own inner wisdom, from her own longing to bridge. And I think about the childhood wonder and the knowing that you name, John. And I think about the knowing in my best friend, Lisa, when she was a little girl. And I think about how, yes, we have, this call to love beyond what evolution requires, like on the lips of spiritual teachers, social formers through the ages, is really just returning us to a kind of knowledge that we have when we're very small, when we're wanting to see, you are a part of me I do not yet know. We are wanting to see ourselves in the stars and the cows and the horses and the butterflies and in each other. And we inherit these theologies and these ideologies that try to break us from each other, sever us from each other. So in a way, it's just returning us to what we once knew, just even a sliver of. And to your question, Monica, it has never been popular to call for love without limit. Never in the history of humanity, because societies and those who consolidate power rely on hierarchies of human value. Every society on the face of the planet, and the longest and most enduring hierarchy of human value on this soil happens to be anti-Black racism. And white supremacy is built on that. So it has never been popular for anyone to call for love without limit. And yet we know what our ancestors taught us, what we are lifting up now is that love is love is only revolutionary when it has no limit. So I said, we've tried that for a very long time. What might happen if those of us who are returning to this inner wisdom, returning to the wisdom of our ancestors, what might happen if we start to reimagine the world?
And Lucas, this reminds me of what you were saying earlier, that is something about the framework of choosing breaking versus bridging. You were saying, I feel like we all started bridged, you know, whether it's childhood wonder, it's something where we all kind of start going, yeah, we're all in on this together, right, guys? Like, we're all doing the same thing. We're living the same life. I don't know. We're not living the same life, but you know what I mean. And something breaks, and then it's about resisting the breaking, right? I think we're coming around to that theme. The question I would like to offer, and y'all can go in any direction, including not the one I'm offering, is usually when there is a system or a pattern, it serves a purpose. And so there is some usefulness that breaking into groups, into us versus them dichotomies, serves us as human beings. Chances are there's some good purposes, probably a lot of them, that breaking might be too harsh, that division serves us to form into groups. The consequences, well, we start us versus theming, you know, which can lead to hate, which certainly stands in the way of revolutionary love, which stands in the way of acceptance, sometimes even of ourselves, and our ability to not be as lonely as we feel. Lucas, to get back to your comments on isolation. So yeah, in the spirit of asking what's the strongest argument over there, right? Like, what purpose does the breaking up into groups serve that is good, that maybe some folks are worried they would lose if they bridged? And anyone can take that. Or go somewhere else, please.
I'm doing something dangerous, and I'm beginning to speak without really knowing what exactly I want to say. But
good.
I mean, and this is maybe partially a response to your question, but it's also, I mean, I want to make sure that we attend carefully to the real experience of pain and frustration and fear and the imbalance of power that people also experience in their daily lives, and try to put these questions in that context. And I find myself really trying to think hard to make sure that I'm responding with that in view. And in that circumstance, I think that you know, there's a way in which we form community. We identify with others as a sense of security, and sometimes that is a necessity. And where it comes to the United States, and when it comes to the subject of white supremacy, we know that that is a lie, right? That sense of security is built on a profound lie about humankind and the dehumanization of others. But the experience of that sense of security is no less real, right? It's something that I understand people to you know, that it really is provides a profound sense of formation, and the loss of that sense of identity, that sense of belonging, feels very threatening and disorienting. And I think that a part of our work with bridging, and I don't even know if bridging is the right framework here, because a part of what we have to do is help people imagine a new way of being together, right? Something that is not a connection between two sides, but something that is encompassing a more full sense of what it means to be human. That's what we need to call people towards. That's what we need to inspire people towards. That's the only way that people, I think, will let go of the fear is if the promise to become something new is compelling enough, and seems, secure enough. And that takes a lot. It takes a holistic vision of where we're going, and I think that's what's needed.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Anyone want to build on that? That's going to a really interesting place.
I so appreciate you, Lucas, for turning us to lived experience and lived struggle. And I think about what is so igniting to me about this time is that I feel our movement, this national global uprising for Black lives and for racial justice, that I never thought I would see in my lifetime, that it is so rooted in that pain of people who have been most oppressed. And now what we're hearing out of that pain is not just resistance, it's reimagining. It's like the darkness of the womb, right? It's like reimagining what our nation could be. And do you remember after this president took power, like it was all about resistance? We're going to resist the policies. We're going to resist the onslaught of hate. We're going to resist. We called ourselves the resistance. Like there were T-shirts. And I was so like excited by that, bold, act of survival. But I was also deeply worried because if we're just resisting, then we're falling into another breaking narrative of us versus them, and we're always.
What are we building, right?
Yeah.
If you're always resisting, what are you building? Yeah.
And so one of these practices in a revolutionary love that I identified in looking through his social movements of the past was reimagine. And I'll just read to you this piece. The greatest social reformers in history did not only resist oppressors, they held up a vision of what the world ought to be. Nanak sang it, Muhammad led it, Jesus taught it, Buddha envisioned it, King dreamt it, Dorothy Day labored for it, Mandela lived it, Gandhi died for it, Grace Lee Boggs, may we be like her, Grace Lee Boggs fought for it for 7 decades. They called for us not only to unseat bad actors, but to reimagine the institutions of power that ordered the world. Any social harm can be traced to the institutions that produce it, authorize it, or otherwise profit from it. To undo the injustice, we have to imagine new institutions and step in to lead them.
Thank you. John, I want to follow up with that the segue from Valerie's quote and Lucas's comments as well. Do some things need to be broken before we can bridge? Can breaking be part of the healthy life cycle of a society in painful transition?
Well, a few things. First of all, if we need to break, we're doing a lot of it. So I feel like in a way, we don't have to create a space to break. It's happening all the time. That the breaking muscle, the breaking habit has been deeply embedded in our society. And you asked also, so if we're breaking, is there a benefit? It's one thing to break at an interpersonal level. I don't like someone and I get all bent out of shape around that. What we're seeing, when we talk about white supremacy, anti-Black racism, xenophobia, we're not talking about breaking at individual level. We're talking about weaponizing, and that breaking actually serving the elites. People, for centuries, working people, poor people, farmers went to war, not for their own benefit, but for the elites. And so they are constantly feeding us, oh no, you shouldn't, this person is different, this person, you have to kill them. And you may have to die in the process as well. And to fairly recently in the United States, if you literally, the rich could pay the poor to go fight for them, even if there was a draft. So it's not just interpersonal, that's one. The other is, Lucas started off by saying, maybe it wasn't bridging. but maybe it was, in a sense, addressing refusing to be broken. So what I take from that, Lucas, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is he's saying we're already connected. And so in a sense, bridging is healing a wound of ignorance. To go back to what Valerie said in terms of like, if there are no strangers, then how is it that I organize whole groups of people as strangers? If I didn't, so anyway, so I think it's more complicated. Do we have the right to resist but not stop there? Yes. Are we in process? Yes. Do we know the extent of our human capacity? No. Are we, one of the radical things that actually didn't get lived out in many religions is that they extended the we. So think about the radical expression of Christianity is that we all belong to God. We're all made in God's image. That's pretty amazing in a world that's where war and fractures and tribes and are constantly at each other. This may not answer your question, but I want to tell you one more story. We're living in New York, in Brooklyn, and come down in a brownstone and come downstairs, and there are insects all over the kitchen. And my daughter, who's like, 12 years old, she's like, has a very visceral reaction. And she says, kill them, to me. And I say to her, why don't you kill them? And she says, that would make me too sad. And I say to her, sometimes I say it should make you sad. You should never be able to take a life, even the life of an insect, without some reflection. And yet sometimes you have to do it. And so what I worry about when we think about breaking is that we can take a life, again, going back to Judith Butler, without grieving a life, without grieving the loss, even when we cause the loss. And it seems to me that if that's what we mean by breaking, then I think when you can take a life without grieving, then no, we should not break. If we mean by breaking that sometimes we have to take a life, then sometimes we do have to take a life, but we need to grieve. So in that sense, and again, going back to Luca's point, I do think we're already connected. We just haven't lived into it. And I think this is part of what Valerie's saying in terms of radical love. But can we live it every day? Can I live it? No, it's an aspiration. And, I was driving the other day and I experienced road rage. Someone got behind me and started honking their horn and putting their lights on. And just a well of conflicting emotions came up, like 1, defend myself, 2, stop and, act like I was 17 and maybe get in a fight, 3, being sad, 4, wanting to talk to the guy. It's like, what's going on? I mean, all these things were happening all at once.
Which did you choose?
I just kept driving. I'm not 17.
I figured you hadn't chosen that one. I just didn't want to assume. All right. Well, I want to bring us to the present, and first get your reaction to one common interpretation of some of what we're seeing, and then your take on the lessons learned from that. The last several months have felt to me like an acceleration, the likes of which I've not seen in my 37 years of existence, in terms of culture shifts that were already happening for sure, but picking up the pace with everything, with race, with politics, with the American identity, with all the us versus thems that existed, feeling strained, like they're at the brink of something. And it seems like every time we get to that, like every time there's a pickup in the pace, I go, well, it can't get any faster than this. And then it does. We're in a pandemic. We're doing this definitely not in person, which would have been hard anyway, to be honest. But still, nobody can do this in person. I can't go have a meeting at a coffee shop. I can't see my family. We're all, my kids, everything is so disrupted. And nobody, the coronavirus didn't follow anyone's orders. It just appeared. And so there is this acceleration. And in that acceleration, I see like a particular challenge for the conversation about bridging. because some of the things that have accelerated are the reckoning conversations that are so necessary. And bridging is not the first thing necessarily people think of with those conversations. It's more fighting, right? So I'd like to hear from y'all. I offer up this question. How does the acceleration of the last few months affect how you view your own work? What new lessons are you gleaning, or new challenges and new struggles where you're sensing yourself preoccupied by a particular facet of the work you've done because the world is in such turmoil and moving so quickly? So that you can take that any direction you'd like. Would anyone like to go first, or do I call on somebody?
It feels like transition.
The labor version of transition?
Yeah, on
say
the
more.
birthing, yeah, on the birthing table, there is the final stage of labor that is the most painful. It is the most breathless. The body expands to 10 centimeters. The contractions come so fast, you can barely take a breath. It feels like a ring of fire forms, like it feels like dying. And yet it is a stage that precedes the birth of new life. And so this moment, when I feel breathless every day, I feel like I have 2 small children. So showing up to mother them while I'm trying to show up to offer mothering to the movement in a time when the onslaught of policies are endless and the death toll keeps rising and that feels like dying. This question, is this the darkness of the tomb or the darkness of the womb? To me right now, it is both. Transition is both. Something is dying. I mean, literally, there are literal deaths, 140,000 people, disproportionately people of color, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, people we will not get back from state violence. That there is literal death that is the darkness of the tomb. And there is the death and the breaking apart of institutions of power that no longer serve us. The story that we've told ourselves about America as a city on the hill, as a land of the free, home of the brave, like that story of exceptionalism is dying for so many people. There's so much that is ending. And, and there are glimpses into the nation that is longing to be. I mean, I have never before seen a wall of white people stand in front of Black people kneeling in the street in front of an army of police officers. We have never seen those images before. So I think about how, if I always had the line of Dr. King in my mind when I was growing up. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. But Dr. King never told us what that shape of the arc is. Like, I always thought of it as this linear, the straight line, right? And if it's a straight line, we are sliding back into darkness. But if we take up this metaphor of birthing labor, then progress during birthing labor, even during transition, it is cyclical. Not linear, it's cyclical. So this moment, 2020, it feels like 1968, it feels like 1992. But through every turn through the cycle, whenever people have risen up, we have created more space for equality and justice and liberation than there was before. We're coming a little bit closer to what is wanting to be born. And here's the thing, Monica, I don't know how many more turns through the cycle it's going to take. But we don't know, just like on the birthing table, you don't know the moment when all you know is that your job is to breathe and to push, is to stay in the labor, And this will be a long labor. Within 25 years, the number of people of color will exceed the number of white people for the first time since colonization. So the stakes and will we birth a nation that has never been truly multiracial, multi-faith, multicultural, where we strive to protect the dignity and wellness of every single one of us, where we see no stranger? Or will we continue to descend into a kind of civil war, a power struggle with those who want to return America to a past where a certain class of white people hold power? And with climate change upon us, we're running out of time. So I feel this tension between wanting to deliver us because the stakes are so high and time is so short, and also knowing that my only job, because on the birthing table time gets really granular, like take the next breath, and then okay, and now you push, my love, now you push. So each day feels like that for me. How am I breathing today? What is my role in pushing today? And just like the body in labor, we carry the memory of our ancestors who came before us. How did they breathe? How did they push? How did they grieve? How did they rage? How did they fight? How did they listen? How did they reimagine? How did they weather their own version of this struggle? And so that is what is giving me energy right now, is to breathe and push and then breathe again.
Thank you. Lucas, you look pensive. I want to know what's on your mind.
I was thinking about, your question about how I experienced the acceleration. And I was wondering, whether or not acceleration is the way I experience it. I mean, I think about what's happening right now in the experience of individual people, sort of the way that all that's happening, the way it's showing up in people's bodies, and the way that people are moved to respond in some way, or just something is happening in them when the whether it be they're recognizing the dissonance between their experience of the pandemic and what's being talked about on television. They're seeing the images of Black people being killed or by police officers, and it's triggering a reaction in them on some gut level that they know that something is wrong, even if it doesn't match their, what they thought they knew about policing in America. And so they know that something is wrong. So I think about that experience, and I think about the multiplication of those experiences and how people are dealing with it, and how it's stirring something and some people it's activating them to join the demonstration, and some people it's energizing them, and other people it's creating uncertainty. It's creating a larger dissonance between what they thought they could rely on as their perception of reality and what the way things actually seem to be. And I think all of that kind of brings me back to the sense of invitation, and what that means in the context of our work is that I want us to try to find ways to accompany that invitation, to try to find ways to help people process and engage in the moral wrestling, and seek out community within which to engage in that moral wrestling.
Right.
I want people to walk towards the questions and not away from them,
Yes.
towards that discomfort. And so I see that as, it feels to me like, I don't know, I mean, it feels to me like an opening that hasn't quite been there before. And that's exciting. It's troubling, it's disturbing, it's uncomfortable, it's a lot of work ahead, but it's exciting too. That's how I'm responding to the acceleration.
Yeah. So an opportunity, right? You're both talking about this is when this is what we're all working toward. This is when you act and you do the hard work. John, what do you make of the acceleration, if that's even what you would describe it as, and how does it stress test your understanding of bridging and the message you'd give to the world?
So I made a little video. It's actually called, you can look at it online if you just Google bridging animated. And it actually is, and this is before COVID and before the recent uprising and before the economy collapsed. And what I was suggesting in that is that there's a lot of indication, Monica, that our worlds are speeding up even before, and that increased speed was creating tensions, was creating anxiety. We can only process so much information in a short period of time without experiencing anxiety. That's not just true of us, that's true of most animals. And in some ways, the mechanisms that we had in place no longer really work. And then the pandemic hits. Now, the thing is, to me, that's interesting about the pandemic is it's a dangerous opportunity. And it challenges all of our systems. And a challenge, in a sense, breaking, even as it potentially exacerbates breaking. It's a pandemic. It means the whole world. I mean, that's in a sense kind of a beautiful thing. You know, it's like, so it's not even, it's not symmetrical. So women, for example, across the world, but certainly in the United States, have a much deeper challenge in terms of the pandemic than men do generally. And that's because of the system of patriarchy. That's because of the system of care for children. That's because of the system of schooling. That's because of the system of who are our essential workers when we think of healthcare. 70% of the workers in healthcare are women. And so over and over again in terms of food. So the systems, it shows the visions that were already there. And so people were surprised when disproportionate number of African Americans and Latinos and Native Americans were dying. And then of course, Trump tried to turn this into a racial thing, talking about the Chinese did it, is their fault. And so it's sort of, in a sense, this tense anxiety brings out the worst and best in people. And a lot of people are desperate to get back to normal. There's no going back to normal. Of course, normal wasn't great for us to begin with, but we're not going back there. The head of the British Health Agency basically said, the coronavirus will be with us, not until Christmas, which Boris Johnson was suggesting, but probably for decades. For decades. So I resist when people say, what do we do in this moment? I said, no, folks, this is not a moment. You know, you can get over that. We're not, you know, and there's all the indication that this is one of many pandemics that we're going to face as a species. That we're going to face the issue of global climate change. And the best way to get through it, I think, is for us to come together instead of turning, as a friend of mine said, instead of turning on each other, we need to turn toward each other. It's not clear we'll do that. It's up in the air. And if we do turn toward each other, we will be okay, I think. If we turn on each other, I don't know we'll survive as a species. And again, it won't be even. Some groups will suffer more than others. Some groups are already suffering more than others, and this will amplify that. So it's a chance for us to turn toward each other and do something really right, to address racism, to address homophobia, to address sexism. But some people see it's all the reason to double down on racism, sexism, homophobia. And it's not clear what we're going to do, not just in this country, but in the world. That's the other thing. It challenges the very nature. So it's like, you know, it's coming from this country. No, it's coming from this country. No, it's coming from that state. No, it's coming from this. It's everywhere. So the last thing I'll say on the pandemic is sort of fascinating in some ways in a disturbing way. Some scientists have said they think they have figured out where the pandemic came from. And when they ask, so where did it come from? Did it come from Wuhan? Did it come from China? They say no. So where did it come from? They say everywhere. That it's been here a long time. And what's happened is that the ecological environmental conditions made it were perfect, but then it began to express itself. And that not only would that be true of this virus, that would be true of future viruses, that climate change has already happened. And we're going to, as it happens, the Earth makes some adjustments. So it's the last thing I'll say is that our systems, our structure, even our grammar, to me, can't fully fit this moment, fit this space, fit this challenge. And so we really have to, as you suggested, Monica, do something deep, profound, and fairly quickly. We don't have I oftentimes say to people, and the good news is in the long run, we'll be fine. The bad news is we don't have a long run.
That is definitely well put. This is the kind of conversation I would like to have like for half a day at least, but we're actually getting within like 13 minutes of closing bell. And one thing we haven't gotten to that I'd like to focus on in the closing minutes is some of the tactics, some of the practices that our viewers and listeners can take away. So bridging can look a lot of different ways depending on maybe you're in an organization and bridging is actually something that is in your mission somehow, right, with different words. Or maybe you're an individual and there's folks in your lives who you feel some connection to, but you know you're drifting apart, and maybe ideologically or the way you look at the world is so different that you're starting to feel almost an animosity. And maybe it's an opportunity to bridge, maybe not. There's a lot of different facets and dimensions to bridging that we've explored here today. But if you could offer a practice for folks to take home on how to embody, how to practice, be the bridger, what would that be? And please take just maybe 2 minutes max so we have time for a closing thought. And I'll start with Valerie.
I'll offer a practice that I started to develop in myself when I began to immerse myself in Guru Nanak's teachings. Nakal Bedi Nahi Begana. How do you see no stranger when we are primed to see the world in terms of us and them, when stereotypes are just in the air and we absorb them whether or not we are conscious of them. And so we have to undo what has been done to us. And that takes practice and conscious choice and repetition, like massive repetition. And so I began some decade ago to walk down the street. Every time I walk down the street or I come across spaces on the news or in the subway or in my neighborhood, I'll say in my mind, sister, brother, aunt, uncle, son, daughter, sibling. And that sometimes I'll switch and say, you are a part of me I do not yet know. You are a part of me I do not yet know. And so that kind of, shifts my orientation to the world. Like I'm cultivating a new way of moving through the world, of being in the world. It is personal and political, because if I'm poised, if I'm training my mind to see no stranger, then that influences who I show up for, what vigils, what protests, who I vote for, how I vote, like who I see as part of me when they are in harm's way. And right now, I believe that choice, to see human family, which I'm still trying to adopt, but I'm seeing people less and less, right, as you mentioned. So I think that there is that is leading me to think more and more about grieving as an act of revolutionary love, as frontline social justice work in this time when there's so much to be grieving. People are grieving loss of life, of people dying alone from this pandemic. People are grieving Black lives. People are grieving their own notion of what they thought the nation was or what the world was, Lucas mentioned. And so how do we be with people in their grief? And I believe grieving together, is the root of transformation. That America's greatest social movements were rooted in the solidarity that came from shared grieving, because when you grieve together, you organize together. When people who have no obvious reason to love each other come together to grieve, they give rise to new relationships, even revolutions. So I am really invested in those spaces where people are finding ways to grieve together, even when we have to be socially distant. I mean, my part is I host 30 minutes on Instagram Live every Monday to build that kind of community, to witness and to hold one another in our grief, and then to send each other the kind of energy and bravery we need to show up another day and to move through it. And if this pandemic is going to be with us for decades, as John has pointed us to, if this is not a moment, this is moving into a new reality. I think that loving each other that way, loving each other through this, is the only way to survive this and to even get to the place where we can begin to reimagine a world where all of us are that beloved.
Yes. Thank you. Lucas. How about you? What would you offer a practice?
You know, I was thinking about saying that we should practice, that we should practice the discipline of asking good questions of ourselves and of other people. But then I realized that what I'm really getting at is is that we should nurture a disposition of curiosity, which I think you'll appreciate, Monica.
Yeah.
Because I think to myself, are we not curious? Like, aren't you curious about the way that the person next to you
Yeah.
is coping? Aren't you curious about the way that they are responding to the same pressures in life that you've had to respond to? Aren't you curious about how they've arrived at the conclusions that they've arrived at? Allow that curiosity to be and to inspire and to drive. And I think that curiosity might guard us from attributing meaning that beyond if we can ask questions, then we won't make the mistake of attributing intentions beyond what someone
Yes.
actually has done or said. It's just curiosity is a really special thing,
Yes.
and we should nurture it in ourselves and in other people, in each other. Yeah.
Well, high fives to that. I'm all about that. That's pretty great.
And can I just add one more high five? Like,
Yeah.
wonder, I call this wonder. Wonder is the wellspring of love and a revolutionary love, right? So we are so aligned in what it takes to begin that labor.
100%. John, want to give us the closing practice, and then we'll move to a mood check. And yeah.
Well, I think I'm in a position. I run a large institute, other than Belong Institute, so I have a great staff, and people are in different places. Some people are, home with 3 kids and trying to deal with no daycare. Some people are fired up and ready to sort of use our resources wisely to try to bend that arc so that we actually get to justice. And some people are in a state of deep reflection and inquiry, and all of those things are happening at once. Also, I think we get questions daily now from leaders of different institutions, from grassroots organizations to the head of Google. What should we do? And I think helping people, not just at a personal level, can we think about building institutions, restructuring institutions so they support belonging, so they support bridging. Right now, our institutions are in the way. We have to fight against them, and so the work seems really hard. The last 2 things I'll say quickly is that one is that, and Valerie touched on this, but I would just reframe it. Part of connecting to each other and Lucas' thing about being curious is really to share in each other's suffering. The curiosity to actually, in human life, and might even be all life, but human life definitely, we have what I call ontological suffering. All of us, even if our lives aren't stuffed out by the police or by bad practices, we all face death, we all face loss. Can we actually turn to each other and share in our suffering? And to suffer together is what compassion means. And again, part of what's happening is people are seeing the other as the enemy and sort of not bridging. And then, so can we bridge, not just with each other, but with the plants, with the earth? Can we slow down? We have to slow down now, right? And some of us.
And a lot of force slowing down recently. Yeah.
And the last thing I'll say on bridging, it's actually very complicated. And I want to commend all of you, and especially Monica, for lifting up some very challenging but important questions. is I encourage people to do short bridges first and then worry about long bridges. Because sometimes when people think about bridges, they go to the most difficult, and then that becomes a reason not to do it, right? It's like, and as I often said, Pastor McBride, when I first shared this with him, he said, so John, are you saying I have to bridge with the devil? And I said, well, don't start there. There may be someone in your family or your neighbor. And I'll end just by this. I have my neighbors next door are Muslim. They're from India. And they wrote me this really, really beautiful letter. And they basically said they felt like they hadn't fully practiced the teachings of Islam in terms of taking care of their neighbor. And they brought over this wonderful dinner that they had cooked. They were already wonderful neighbors. I felt a little embarrassed. But they were trying to reach out. They were bridging. They were saying, we're in this together and we'd like to. And then they said, so tell us when we should cook you your next dinner. So whatever the practice is. And I was just so touched by that. I mean, just so loving and caring.
Cool.
I don't know if that's a short bridge or a long bridge, but it was a delicious bridge.
Yeah, it can be surprisingly small gestures, in a small scope to a neighbor or a friend or whoever's sitting next to you, in any given moment. I want to thank you all so much for this. I'm going to turn things over to Brian because we're coming right up against the edge of our time. So Brian, take it away.
Cheers. No, just echoing that gratitude. I mean, such a gift to be part of this conversation and to, there's so many choice little nuggets there, but even the invitation, but the notion of an invitation, which Lucas kind of returned to repeatedly in this invitation to do moral wrestling. But as all of you spoke so nicely too, like not alone, right? Like in community, find people with whom to grapple with this. And I like, I think Valerie's metaphor of childbirth is such a powerful one because it does invite us to think about a lived experience that, many women have been through, many men and other people have been witness to, and how transformative that experience is if you let yourself feel, right? And so, yeah, just excited about what that invitation means. I've put in the chat a few links for folks. If you haven't already, Valerie's new book is amazing. You should check it out. Monica's forthcoming book, which hopefully we'll hear more about at some point, on curiosity, seems very attuned to the vibe of this conversation. We will have another maybe 8 or 9 conversations on transformation. The next one is August 11th on, appropriately enough, societal healing, featuring Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, Stacey Haynes, Tada Hazumi, and Kazu Haga. And it's going to be incredible. I'm super excited about that. And you can follow us more about building belonging on Medium. I dropped that link in the chat. If folks are interested in joining the community that we're co-creating together, you can register for our next orientation, August 19th. Please find more information, and if you don't already follow them, On Being and the Other New Belonging Institute, where John is, are both incredible contributors to this moment. And the garbage truck is pulled up outside, which is my cue to end this. So thank you all for joining, and especially for folks from other time zones. Lucas, thanks for sharing some of your evening with us from Netherlands. I actually saw one person live chat from Tokyo, where I believe it is currently 3:30 a.m. So deep respect to that person, and thank you all for joining us. This has been a real gift. Gonna end the live stream here. Actually, you know what? I'm not gonna end the live stream. Let's give one last round to the folks here. A closing mood check, 2 or 3 words that any of you want to offer. I'm gonna start with Monica and then invite her to pass it to the rest of our crew.
Accepting invitation. Looking around to make sure I understand what they are and then accepting them. Hopefully not so many that I lose my mind, but invitations accepted, labor engaged.
Gratitude. I'm just grateful for this conversation. Grateful for all of you, and want to maintain a disposition of gratitude and curiosity. So, thank you.
Joy. This time together was joyful, and it makes me think of the Sikh concept of Chardikala, ever rising joy, ever rising high spirits, even in darkness, even in the midst of the labor. I think joy gives us energy for that long labor. So thank you for this joy that I feel in my body right now.
And I guess I would use the word love. I mean, I feel like certainly this group here, I feel like I'd like to give all of you just a big hug and a big expression of gratitude. But also, I just feel, being smart, being insightful is one thing, but I think, and you're certainly that, but you're also loving and open and caring. So thank you.
Thank you all. And with that, I will end the live stream. And you're also getting lots of love from the folks on the